Everyone, welcome to Morbid Symptoms. We're about ready to start. We're going to talk about the housing mafia and the housing crisis in Scotland, a bit about scapegoating of immigrants in Islam. Elon Musk, this guy you might have heard about, was tweeting quite a bit about the rape of Britain, and people were taking to the street with the English flag to take their country back. So we're going to talk a bit about that. And I'm not sure why we're in these little pictures, these little picture bubbles. But while I figure that out, Laura, do you want to introduce yourself a bit?
Yeah, my name is Laura Jones. I'm a housing activist and feminist. I live in Scotland, in Glasgow. And what I'm laser focused on, because we've got this huge homelessness crisis, got a whole lot of homeless women, we actually have legislation which says that when you apply as homeless to the council, if you go to the council and you say, I don't have anywhere to stay, they have a legal obligation to find you emergency accommodation immediately, with an aim to then getting you into permanent accommodation thereafter. That hasn't been happening. It hasn't been happening for years. The councils have been breaking the law on this, but now it's getting beyond, because we have got this massive inflated crisis. You've got thousands of people being told, no, there's no accommodation available. And then the lucky ones, the ones that are lucky enough to get housed, they're getting put in hotel accommodation, which people think hotel and they imagine hotels that they've stayed in, right? You know, free buffet breakfast and daily cleaning and all the rest of it. No, that's not what's happening in these places. Lucky if you get a room to yourself, if there's a lock on the door, if your sink or your shower are functioning. The food that you get is abysmal, often moldy. We've had complaints about rats. We've had complaints about bed bugs, damp and mold. These places are substandard. So they've actually broken the law on 13,000 and above occasions. These places have been shown to have broken the unsuitable accommodation order, i.e. they are not suitable for people to live in. They're also rife with drug dealing. There's been an epidemic of deaths in these places, mostly young people, a lot of suicides and a lot of drug deaths. And the dealers just hang around out the front door. There's very little policing seems to go on. And as you can imagine, it didn't used to be the case that women would be stuck in B&B and hotel accommodation. And if that happened, it would be, an extreme last minute resort kind of thing that was done for a couple of days while they sort something else out. Now we're looking at women stuck on their own in these mixed sex facilities for an average of 53 weeks. So
I'm trying to get the math.
currently there's 366 women in Glasgow stuck in these mixed sex facilities, and that includes 85 families with children. So we're talking about kids, little kids, toddlers often, staying in dangerous, scary places full of very scary men a lot of the time, surrounded by drug dealers and sex traffickers, and they're living in these places for months and months on end. Changes their whole personality, their whole outlook on life, their chances, their mental, their physical health, everything. And we've had women reporting sexual assault, rape, and a lot of trafficking, a whole lot of trafficking going on, which again, the authorities seem to be turning a blind eye to, because these places break the law again and again, and there's never been any penalties applied to them.
You mentioned that these places are getting all kinds of money to provide emergency housing. And you said they had over like 13,000 violations, that they're technically shouldn't be housing anybody, but yet it keeps on going on. So maybe you could expand a bit about the hotel mafia or gangster hoteliers.
Well, there's 40 hotels just in Glasgow that are providing this service, most of which are owned by just two families. I mean, we've had hundreds of millions spent on them so far. Last year, I believe it was 54 million for the year. Next year, it's projected to be 66 million spent on the hotel accommodation. And it just goes up and up. They keep putting their prices up, and they can, because the council has nowhere else to put people. So the answer that you get all the time is like, well, what can we do? We need these hotels. it still doesn't really explain why they're allowed away with everything. There's never any penalty, there's never any fines applied or whatever. So it seems that they are protected from the law in that sense. People that try to call attention to this issue are being targeted. So we have a night shelter that the council are determined to close down. The reason they're giving is that they didn't have the correct planning permission to use the building in the way that it's being used. But the real reason, I think, is because they're working with a legal agency, and every single person that comes through their doors and gets housed for the night, given shelter for the night, gets sat down and fills out a form, and a letter gets sent to the council saying, why have you breached your legal duty to shelter this person for the night? That's why they're trying to shut them down, because they're trying to hold them to account. At the same time as the police and other agencies are dumping people on their doorstep, the council are trying to close them down. Not only these people making money hand over fist for dangerously substandard illegal accommodation. I mean, you would only need to go and stand outside one of these hotels in the city centre for 5 minutes and you would see drug dealing happening. And you may well see teenage girls being accosted or buying drugs off a big gang of dodgy looking men. Somehow there is no police presence, no security, no safety, no oversight in these places whatsoever. So increasingly, my suspicion is policymakers are so far behind normal people who just walk in the city centre and see what's going on, or especially the people who actually have stayed in these places, because they are 100% convinced that the owners of the hotels, that the police, that the policymakers are in cahoots, that they all know what's going on, and that it's one big virtuous cycle where they're all helping each other to make money. So unfortunately, I would not put it past the families that run these hotels to also be involved in the drug dealing, the drug trafficking, and the trafficking of women that goes on. Increasingly, women who report violent assaults to staff in the hotels are threatened and told that if they don't keep their mouths shut, they'll get kicked out on the street. So people have learned not to contact the authorities, not even to phone an ambulance. In some cases, when somebody was having, for example, an overdose, they're being told not to phone ambulances. The staff frequently are themselves potentially working illegally a lot of the time, so they're afraid as well. On one occasion, for example, some paramedics turned up because a guy was having an overdose, and the staff ran out the fire escape to avoid dealing with it. So just so much exploitation going on at every possible level, in every possible way. So much money being made, like insane amounts. It's a whole industry now. I've seen somebody's been calling it the homeless industrial complex, and that's absolutely what it is. It is an industry, and everybody wants to argue about it as if it's a resource issue. There is plenty of money out there, and it is being covered up by these absolute gangsters. I blame the owners, I blame the police, and I blame anyone in the council who has not been screaming and tearing their hair out about this, because this has been an obvious problem that has been growing for a long time, and it has inevitably led to increased racial tensions because, and this wasn't the case until just recently, but now over half of the people staying in these hotels are now asylum seekers. And I think people need to remember that these hotels are where they put homeless people. So it's not just refugees.
So, excuse me if you said this before, how long has this been kind of the de facto or official policy to use certain hotels as homeless shelters or emergency accommodation shelters?
I couldn't tell you when it began. It was certainly always a thing. The homeless problem wasn't big enough that, I mean, we had a few. Generally, it was men. I did know women that were put in these places before, but usually only for a couple of weeks tops. It would often be a refugee family, and then the refugee council would come in and find them a place, for example. So it would be people that maybe didn't have recourse to public funds. Something would have to be figured out with other agencies, that kind of thing. But it was not normal to put women, and especially not women with children, that kind of accommodation. Also, the accommodation was much less cramped. the conditions have definitely worsened because they can get away with a lot more now. I think the reason that women and children in particular ended up being increasingly housed in that kind of accommodation, frankly, is because we got rid of all the feminists from any organization, from any government think tank policy group that might affect policy. We purged them all. We said no one's allowed to talk about single sex spaces anymore. And as a result, this kind of, I don't think it was a deliberate choice or a deliberate thing that was pushed. It just happened. And the people that would have usually been there to call attention to it and to say, no, hang on, this is a problem, just weren't there.
You shouldn't assume that someone's a man or a woman.
Well, there's that too.
How do you know? How do you know that?
I've yet to see a single trans identified person turn up in the statistics.
I was making that quib because when you said they got rid of all the feminists, I'm assuming you mean all the feminists that didn't go along with gender identity and would say things like, well, what about single sex spaces, when single sex or sex became like a bad word?
Yeah, a lot of people would be like, oh, she's saying that unless you're a TERF, you're not a feminist. And it's like, well, where were they then? Why didn't the SNP or anyone in the Green Party call attention to this before? Because I'm sorry, but the ones that care about single sex spaces are the ones who care about the safety of women. And the ones that don't and that kept their mouths shut or stuck the boot in when feminists were having these arguments, they're not the ones that are going to put their necks out to try to defend these women and to make the changes, especially when there's huge amounts of money, you know, changing hands and very powerful people who seem to be in a position where they want to continue to ignore this situation or who are making money out of this situation. So yeah, I very much think that this is partially the effect of that discourse taking hold and it becoming very untrendy and very dangerous for your career as a politician to start drawing attention to these things.
Yes, so there seems to be a configuration of factors, privatization of the council houses and ownership society and this type of thing. So council housing, that's been decreasing. And then you also have the various economic ups and downs and then increasing immigration. And so you have those factors. And then you have the vested economic interests of the people that make money for housing people in their hotels. And it seems that nobody is in a big rush to enforce the regulations or to take care of the criminality that is springing up around these areas.
That's right. And in Glasgow, we've got the added issue that we have homelessness legislation in Scotland, which is on the surface very progressive. Everybody in Scotland has a right to housing, has a right to shelter. And this is where this local authority, be it having this legal obligation to house people that present as homeless, comes from. The problem with that is that people are now coming to Glasgow to present as homeless. So the Foreign Office is sending them all to Glasgow. It's just that as a result of the legislation that we have, people are coming here because they think that this is their best chance of getting housed. And so it has been a big strain on the housing in Glasgow. This is the main thrust of the arguments that the racists are making or that Reform have seized on here in Scotland. But the numbers aren't that big. We're a small country, right? So a few thousand people seems like a really big deal. But if we could just figure out a way, for a start, if we're going to have loads of extra people to house, it's mind-boggling to me that it never occurred to either the Scottish government or the councils to say, can we have some more money for housing? That seems like a really obvious thing to do. And none of them seem to have wanted to do it. Say we should have more money for housing. We should be building houses. We should also be figuring out other solutions like, well, if other local authorities aren't taking in their fair share of people and they aren't housing people, then what's that about? Can we sort that out? Can we get some kind of system where people are encouraged to go to other towns in Scotland and then we could have welcome hubs and things that are geared towards integration? We've also got this problem that we continue to blow up hundreds of social homes all the time at the same time as moaning that we don't have enough housing. So there's an awful lot going on, you know, the hundreds of millions that we're spending on these hotels instead of directing that at proper homeless services and building homes.
Well, not to mention the extra cash that goes to Ukraine, NATO. So Jerry's comment says, I assume that the use of hotels was ramped up in 2020 due to them not being used to lockdowns. So was that something that happened and they thought, hey, this is a good idea. We can,
It did
our
increase
friends in the hotel
massively.
industry.
Absolutely. I mean, I know we had been using them before. I think it's as the crisis has exploded, more and more of these places are just seeing it as an easy way to make money. And it's way easier than running an actual hotel. And of course, way more lucrative.
Well, and I'm assuming, yeah, they're not having maid service. So it's just
Yeah.
probably kind of like just, I don't know, security or someone to take the cut of the drug money.
There's
Sorry,
no requirement.
allegedly. I have visions of The Wire in my head now. So.
That's what Glasgow's like, basically.
So what you're saying is that it's probably a mistake to attribute the criminality and the degeneracy that's developing around these areas to the village their grandparents came from in rural Pakistan and stuff like that. And before someone jumps on me, obviously what somebody does, they're doing, but it seems that the structures encourage this type of behavior. And then people see this behavior, and the first thing they see is like, oh, well, there's all these immigrants here, these refugees, and they're coming in, and look at all this crime and the trafficking and this and that. And it seems what you want to make clear is that, okay, people are responsible for the actions that they take. But if you look at the context, it's not surprising that these things are developing in this way. And there's a lot of people who are not coming over on the boat, as I like to say, that are making quite a bit of money, that are probably just as bright white as I am.
Yes, I have spoken to countless people now that have stayed in the hotels. I've been following them all very closely. We get monthly stat updates about what's going on in the hotels, how many people are dying, what they're dying of a lot of the time, as well as speaking to various politicians and organizations, charities, etc. I have not seen any evidence whatsoever that your ethnicity makes you more or less likely to either engage in these criminal activities or to be a victim of them. What I'm seeing is it's a social issue that is being created, and it's just a really obvious one to me. I mean, especially when you see kind of gender critical feminists who had such a good analysis of why single sex spaces were important, who were saying all along, look, no, you can't have men sharing certain kinds of spaces with women where they're at their most vulnerable. That will lead to danger. And those same people turning around and saying, oh, sexual assault and violence against women happens because Islam. And you're like, what? Hang on, I thought you had a sex-based analysis of this, and now you're saying it's all because they're foreign. What you've got is they're taking largely young men, because the ratios of men to women in these places are 14-1 as like an average basically across them. But there's one in town where they have like 250 odd rooms, and at one point they had 4 women staying in it. So the women are hugely outnumbered by the men. So even if the vast majority of those men are completely sound, nice people that are actually looking out for you and protecting you, what are the chances that you're going to get some crap off one of them? Do you know what I mean? And so a lot of women are self-excluding from these services and have done for ages. They would rather, a lot of them, sleep under a bridge. And I don't even mean in the summer, I mean in the winter in Glasgow, where it's sub-zero temperatures. They would rather go and sleep under a bridge with people that they know than have to be in these places where there are men that they don't know, you know, banging on their door, following them into their room, etc. And you can't tell a manager, you can't tell the staff, because they're nowhere to be found. If you do tell them, they'll say it's your fault, and they'll threaten to kick you out. Very little protection. In fact, the only protection these women have is from the good men in those hotels, because obviously there are a lot of good men. And there's a community among homeless people. They do look out for each other. But the problem you've got is you're putting mostly young men, and not all of them, but a lot of them with addiction issues, trauma, you know, possibly previous incarceration, etc. You're sticking them all in a place together for months and months and months on end. It grinds you down. Spoken to mothers of young men that died in these hotels, who've died of overdoses, etc. Some of them, they'd never been on drugs before, but after 40 odd weeks of staying in somewhere that grim, that depressing, being treated like an animal, some of them end up turning to, you know, someone offers you, maybe even out the kindness, you know, offers you a Valium to help you sleep. You take it, one of them's dodgy, that's you, that's your life. And it's them. It's
Yeah.
completely
Well, and this is nothing new. There's certain categories of people that people who are predators are going to prey upon. Of course, homeless people and homeless women and homeless young women. And then you put them in a slum hotel. They're outnumbered by men, 50 to 1 or 4. It's not surprising that things are going to happen, which is not to excuse the people who do it. I wanted to ask just the geography of this. Are these hotels spread out throughout Glasgow? Or are they in certain neighborhoods? Because I can't imagine. I'm assuming they're not in the really swanky parts of Glasgow. Assuming there is still a swanky part of Glasgow.
Yeah, there's one, for example, on the south side that's bordering on Govan Hill, which can be a bit rough, but it's in a pretty nice part of Glasgow in Shawlands, and it's called the Queen's Park Hotel, and it is absolutely notorious. I think 7 people have died there since the beginning of the year. It's had more call outs, what is it, over 400 call outs in a year for the police. My friend was put in there a few years ago, and on our very first night, a guy pushed his way into her room. But the really big ones are concentrated in the city centre in sort of a square, so they're all fairly close to each other. And that's where it's getting scary now. I never felt scared walking around Glasgow. And I'm like approaching 40. I don't get much crap off young men in the street anymore. But I am scared now walking in Glasgow city centre because there's just a vibe. There's crack being smoked in broad daylight everywhere you go, being dealt, big gangs of guys hanging around dealing, often with like vulnerable looking young women or just women hanging around with them. Lots of women begging, lots of people of both sexes begging, but a lot more women than I'd ever seen before. And I've been trying to get women that have experienced the hotels to speak out about it. And there was one in particular that was helping me. And we went looking for this girl that had been attacked a couple of nights previously in the hope of speaking to her and to offer her some support. And she kind of took me under her wing and said, all right, Laura, pretend you're homeless, pretend you're looking for a place for the night. And I was walking around with her, and like I already don't feel safe just walking around as me, anonymous me. But for her, having stayed a couple of months in one of these hotels, she was recognized by everybody. They all clocked her as somebody that had been in the hotels. And it was like she was just a magnet. All these guys were approaching her, asking her for money for drugs, like instantly. And then we bumped into some women on the street and we started chatting to them. And like in 5 minutes, some guy walks up and starts screaming at them. One of them, oh, you owe me money, or you stole money off my friend, or whatever. And all these girls basically had to stand on the street corner and try to talk this guy down. And I realized it was because there was no point running away. There's no point trying to get rid of him or shake him off, because they're just going to have to deal with him again later on the same day or the next. So it's like they had to deal with it there and then. And most of them are walking around with bruises or cuts or whatever, like they're all wearing obvious signs of violence. So yeah, as an actual homeless woman, absolutely terrifying just to be in that situation, and you're just in constant survival mode. You need to find friends, you need to find people that you can have with you as much as possible. And the ones that are weaker, more vulnerable, more traumatized do not stand a chance. And you will just stick yourself to the least bad, the least scary guy that you can find to keep the others at bay. I mean, you'd be daft not to. That's your only chance of survival a lot of the time. And again, if you don't go back to the hotel, because you need to be there by curfew every night or you lose your room.
When's the curfew?
8 o'clock or 10 o'clock, I'm not sure which one. Maybe it's 10. But if you're not back one night, so there was one girl, she'd had guys banging on her door and she was terrified, and she went and stayed with a friend one night, and then she's out on the street. And then last we knew, she's staying in some house somewhere with a bunch of guys.
So it seems that you and some other people are trying to keep a focus on this issue, but given the money and given the economic incentives to maintain the status quo, it seems that the narrative that's taking off is that it's something to do with the ethnicity or the religion of the people who are most noticeable in and around these hotels. What do you see? Are you at all hopeful? Is there going to have to be some sort of really bad situation that happens before people realize that we can't keep on how we are with this hotel setup and this kind of archipelago of criminality that the police are just kind of pretending isn't there?
Well, the hotels, they've basically become giant recruitment centers for organized crime. So that's what they are. And Craig Murray's thing about how they should let them work is, yeah, partly true. Obviously, if you have a bunch of guys stuck in these places and they basically can't work, what are they going to do? Like, because there'll be guys hanging around outside every day saying, why don't you, sell this package for me? And, that's how they get into it. And obviously the less scrupulous ones will end up targeting young girls because young girls are money too,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of them are working illegally for people that are more than happy to pay £2 an hour as a wage. And so this is another reason why people in Glasgow are starting to get more drawn in by the kind of reformy type arguments, is that it's harder to get jobs now because there are people that are working for basically slave
Yes.
but the problem there isn't the poor people that are being exploited. Why is no one looking at the guys paying these wages? It's the same problem, with the left refusing to look at the hotels. Like they're coming out support of the hotels almost. They're having these demonstrations, to counter the far right that are, marching
Mm-hmm.
around saying we need to burn them down and all the rest of it, which I'm scared that is going to start happening. It happened in Ireland. It's been happening in Ireland for a while. And it's really dangerous putting people in these ghettos essentially. But the left just comes out and goes, oh, we'll all get together and we'll have a bunch of banners and we'll scream at them and call them racist until they magically evaporate.